some questions. We are now moving to Hamish Jenkins, and he's a senior program officer. He works on issues related to social and economic justice and alternative development strategies at NGLS. He has also worked at the International Labour Organization on the social dimension of globalization as research coordinator in NGO networks and on access to environmental justice and as a freelance journalist. He was the lead author of an NGLS policy handbook, Decent Work and Fair Globalization, a guide to policy dialogue. His background is in development studies. Mr. Hamish Jenkins, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ellie, for this invitation and this opportunity to share with you some of my experiences. You wanted me to focus on very practical examples of lobbying and advocacy strategies. So in order for me to do this perhaps more meaningfully, I'll take off my UN hat and put on my civil society hat, which I used to be a civil society activist, as you just mentioned, before joining the UN. So I can give you some of my own experiences, both before I joined NGLS and after. And I think, one of the first things that when I was still a student that I was struck with is how difficult it is to actually assess be able to prove the causal link between lobbying and advocacy and actual impacts in terms of outcomes of intergovernmental negotiations or impacts in terms of implementation. It's not something that's easy, and it's not only an academic question, which is the question that I had at the time when I was a student, but also in terms of being able to mobilize the resources that are needed to carry out this work. I mean, in order to come to a very expensive city like Geneva, every time the donors are saying, but how can one measure the impact of this or that activity? And I remember as a student, I was here over the summer of '91 and was working voluntarily for one of the NGOs that were implicated in the preparatory process for the first Rio conference, the Conference on Environment and Development. And what was striking is the extent to which this work is very much often behind the scenes. So, for example, at the time, you had an NGO network that many of you probably know called Third World Network, who had actually drafted most of the policy positions on behalf of the group of 77 developing countries. I mean, at the time, there was very little expertise and capacity to understand the complex linkages between development and environment within a framework of asymmetric economic relations between developed and developing countries. So, Sonia, you mentioned one of the first important attributes is competence. So very much the ability of civil society to contribute expertise in areas where professional diplomats or even certain administrations who just don't have the resources and the capacities to develop that knowledge is absolutely essential. And one of my first experiences of this was in the context of the build-up to the Habitat 2 conference in '96. At the time, I was working with a network of activists and researchers on the question of access to environmental justice in different cities of Africa and Asia. And this conference was focusing on human settlements. Habitat 2 refers to the UN Conference on Human Settlements. And within that, basically, we thought this is an opportunity to try and introduce into the outcome of this conference the results of all this research and experience from both lawyers and activists in trying to achieve access to land, access to water and sanitation services in an inclusive manner based on real experiences in different cities. But we had to do this in a way that would translate this research into something that was palatable to the, let's say, the lingo of the United Nations. So we took this research and converted it into a series of generic recommendations that we would propose to delegates. Now, this first example I'm giving you is of probably one of the most open and participatory processes in the United Nations history. I mean, we heard that we have, in theory, these rights enshrined in the Charter, but in practice, these rights are implemented in very uneven ways, and I'm going to try and show you examples from different types of, let's say, levels of openness. So in the case of the build-up to Habitat 2, it was really exceptional in the sense that civil society groups, especially in the beginning of the negotiating process, were able to participate directly in the drafting negotiations. I mean, not as governments, but as experts that could be available to provide suggestions at the request of a government delegate. So what we did is we approached various governments that then could act as champions, and when the particular section of the document where we had proposals would come up on the table, they would circulate the draft language and then request the NGO to explain the rationale for that. And I mean, I must say, among the various lobbying skills, one of them is luck. And in this case, the section that they were dealing with was popular participation and civic engagement. And basically, they had no idea what to put in that section, so it was, in that sense, quite easy. And basically, virtually all the elements that were tabled at that early drafting session, with some minor amendments, made their way into the final document. Bearing in mind that the reason they were there is that we were able, based on the experience on the ground, to show how these generic formulations about redress, about the ability for local communities to set agendas, what does it mean in practice and what difference does it make on the ground. So that was quite a landmark experience, where actually, just as a short anecdote, was almost reversed in the 5-year review that took place in 2001. You had a change of government in one of the major member states. I won't need to name which one, but basically there was a concerted effort among that member state and some rather unsavory regimes to basically not allow any NGOs to participate, not even simply as passive observers. And the objective of that move was to be able to negotiate in much more tranquility, an effort to remove all references to the human right to housing and to all references to female-headed households. That basically took 4 days of a 5-day prepcom of negotiations back and forth, which ended up to a vote where only 3 or 4 countries voted against. So then civil society was again allowed to participate, and the right to housing and the reference to female-headed households was maintained in the text. I mean, that's one of the frustrations you will find often in intergovernmental negotiations going forward, is that texts that seem to be agreed language, I mean, for example, in the Rio +20 process, every time NGOs have to redefend established principles such as the precautionary principle or the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. And that's not the most, let's say, agreeable part of the job, but it's essential because, you know, what's achieved in one document can often be questioned. And in that sense, the world is not necessarily going in a better direction. Actually, the philosopher president of Czechoslovakia, Václav Havel, think it was for the 50 years anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, said the last thing we would want is to try to renegotiate such a declaration, because at the time people were coming out from the rubbles of a horrible Second World War, and really saw that the dangers and what were the root causes for the rise of fascism. And in the current context, we're seeing very much similar patterns happening now, and any new negotiation of such a text would probably be a step backward. Another example of a very open process much more recently is the follow-up to one of the outcomes of the Rio +20 summit of 2012, which was to start a process towards the negotiation of a new set of sustainable development goals that are supposed to succeed the Millennium Development Goals that have to be met by next year, by 2015. And it was called an open working group on sustainable development goals with 30 seats, composed of about 70 countries who were sharing these seats. And the co-chairs, the ambassadors of Hungary and Kenya, really made an effort to make this live up to the Rio mandate, where it really had to be as inclusive as possible with all the relevant stakeholders. And there one could literally see, measure, so to speak, the impact of civil society participation. I mean, there were daily hearings with the co-chairs and other interested member states from 9 to 10. And then during the negotiations, at regular intervals, civil society were able to intervene, introduce written documents, again, were language that then could be picked up by member states. And then when you saw the draft evolve over the several negotiating sessions up till July, what was interesting is they had these asterisks over each proposed, let's say, segment of a goal and then the target that would basically reference where the source of that proposal came. And what was interesting is that you didn't just see member states, whether it was Japan or India or France or other, but you also saw which NGOs or coalitions of NGOs that proposed language, and that then were picked up by the co-chairs. And you saw that it did create a dynamic. I mean, one of the issues that was most difficult to have among the 17 goals that are now proposed for further negotiation by the General Assembly was a reference to climate change. And, so you had these sessions where you had a number of countries objecting to any reference to climate change. This is a separate process dealt with by UNFCCC. But then the Hungarian co-chair will say, yeah, but that's all very well, but what am I going to tell civil society tomorrow morning? What arguments are you going to give me? And they didn't have any other than some technical arguments, bureaucratic arguments rather. So I mean, the outcome is not perfect. I think from what I've heard from many gender groups is that, for example, the gender goal is a pretty good start. I mean, looking both at the goal and the targets. One of the limitations is that gender is not sufficiently mainstreamed across the goals, but really civil society did make a difference there. Also, I think another breakthrough was a goal on reducing inequality within and among countries, which have been rather unthinkable when the process started, for those who know how frustrating intergovernmental negotiations are. Now, just maybe I'll end with another example that gives that shows maybe a different set of skills that had to do with a much more closed process, but that didn't prevent civil society from having a major impact. And that was the 13th United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. I mean, for you who don't know, you're actually sitting in the building of UNCTAD, which was created in the 60s by the non-aligned movement of developing countries who were in the process of decolonization. And while the founding of the UN had many good things, there were also lots of flaws, not least of which was that most of the world was under colonial occupation. And that particular conference was looking at, structural inequalities within and between countries, and structural inequalities between developing and developed countries. And that, let's say, body of the UN has been recently described as the economic conscience of the United Nations. And as many of you may know, there is an attempt by certain major interests to try and keep the hardcore economic issues outside the strict purview of the United Nations, that these issues are much better dealt with by organizations that de jure are still part of the UN system, such as the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank, or actually in the case of the World Trade Organization, legally outside the UN system, for reasons that have to do with the fact, I would say, that the United Nations is a much more democratic space to discuss these very difficult issues of economic governance. But there is a strong pull by many member states that the UN should have a central role in the matter, and that these other institutions should, in fact, be made accountable to the UN's broad agenda, including human rights, sustainable development, and other major normative goals. So the one space within the UN that has been a very dissident voice in terms of, for example, criticizing the austerity measures in Europe that, in the view of UNCTAD, is a self-defeating exercise. There were strong efforts back in 2012 to basically clip the wings of UNCTAD and remove all reference to, in its mandate, to dealing with macroeconomic and financial issues, including the understanding the causes and consequences and what responses can be brought to the global financial crisis. Now, I'm told my time is up, but this was a very important moment of civil society leadership, because these negotiations were taking place behind closed doors. Civil society were not allowed in the room. The Secretariat was in a dilemma because it couldn't really make these draft texts available. But eventually there were ways through member states to get these drafts out, then to create a momentum of public mobilization to show that this is totally unacceptable. And the civil society forum that took place the weekend before the start of the conference was a space not only to finalize a rather seminal civil society declaration of the same kind that you're producing for this meeting, that also will be annexed as that one in the official document. But most importantly, to undertake media work, to occupy the media space, to show to expose the contradictions of what some of these member states were saying. And then very early on, once that media buzz was out there, to call upon the heads of delegation of all the member states or groupings of member states that were causing obstruction. And that actually exposed the fact that there hadn't been proper, let's say, consultation between different ministries, so that the technical people who were negotiating the text, for example, in the case of the European Union, were taking orders directly from the Department of the European Commission that deals with trade issues, and they hadn't consulted their ministries of development. And then when the heads of delegation came to the conference in Doha, for example, in the case of Finland, it was the development minister, there was a meeting organized with NGOs that showed how the EU was actually opposing language that it had agreed in other conferences, whether it was biodiversity and other issues. So basically that coalition during the week kind of fell apart, and at the end of the day, as many people called it, the Battle of Doha was won. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you so much for this introduction, what goes on behind the doors And you can imagine the fighting, negotiating, horse trading, I would call it, right? That is the daily business at the UN.